What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of the most difficult games I've 100%, which is a subject I haven't talked about in quite some time, roughly a year or so I thought it would be fun to talk about some more video games that have given me a run for my money, so to speak. But at the beginning, I do want to mention that difficulty is an interesting thing when it comes to video games because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What I consider difficult and what any random other person considers difficult might vary drastically. And there are things I've struggled with in games that I know for a fact other people have completely just walked right through. And something I found when I started doing this for a living, that is to say reviewing games, was that given enough time, I could pretty much always do it. So oftentimes it becomes a question of how long is this going to take me versus can I do this? And I think that's worth keeping in mind as we move through these. But before we get into the list proper, I do want to give a sort of honorable mention to the game that remains probably the moment I struggled with the most at the very least, which is Tyranny, a CRPG from Obsidian, and while I wouldn't really consider it a difficult game overall, on its highest difficulty level, Path of the Damned, the boss of the first act of the game to this day remains probably the biggest roadblock I've ever experienced in gaming in terms of trying to get something done. It took me days, and when I finally managed to do it, I genuinely couldn't tell you how or why. The dice kind of just finally rolled in my favor, and I was able to move on to the rest of the game, which hilariously got a bit easier, which is something I've talked about in the past, so I didn't really want to make it an official part of this list. But in case you were curious, yes, that still remains probably one of the most difficult moments I've had in gaming, period. And with that out of the way, let's dive into the rest of this. First up, we have Lies of P, a recent Souls-like title that has been very positively received. And while I'm certainly not new to that genre, I've covered quite a few of them here on the channel, I've played even more. Lies of P, thanks to a variety of factors I would say, is one that I struggled with more than just about any other Souls-like in recent memory. Some of which I've talked about previously in a video about games I wanted to rage quit, for instance. For starters, Lies of P really focuses on parrying. There are other ways to mitigate incoming damage from enemies, but parrying is by far the most effective. The problem with this is that that's probably the type of damage mitigation in a Souls-like that I struggle with the most. The timing on a parry has never been my strong suit, especially in games that intentionally stagger out enemy attack animations to deliberately mess up your timing. So Souls-likes that specifically focus on that part of it I tend to struggle with, more so than others. But at the same time, Lies of P is also a relatively linear title where there's not exactly a lot to go explore and do, meaning that if you get stuck and need to level up, you're basically just grinding the same areas over and over again, which you might find yourself doing, though luckily I didn't have to do too much of that myself. But it might come up because the bosses in this game are very capable of being roadblocks. They have been nerfed a bit since launch, so this might not necessarily be the case anymore, but many of them had 2 full phases with a different health bar and effectively different attack patterns and animations and everything, so it often felt like just fighting 2 bosses back to back, and that's just the major bosses. There was also a variety of minor bosses, and in some cases, just some especially strong enemies that I struggled with more than the major bosses. And while all those things are difficult in their own way, that's actually not why I'm putting this game on the list, but rather the second to last boss, which I don't think I have a lot of footage of to show you. But nonetheless, I got stuck on that boss for about 6 or 7 hours in total, and with it being so close to the end game, that's not necessarily unheard of. It's a tough boss with a ton of attacks that deal massive damage, and if you mess up, you die. So it took me just an exceptionally long time to master the various attack patterns at play, and then even with that knowledge, it was still a struggle. So I finally figured it out. I finally beat this boss I've been stuck on for like 6 hours, only to turn around, go a little bit farther, and find out that that wasn't actually the final boss. There's one more boss fight, depending on a choice you make. And that was probably the moment that it kind of registered to me that I had struggled with Lies of P more than just about any other game in recent memory. And while I wouldn't consider it exceptionally difficult in comparison to many other Souls-likes, in fact, if you're good at parrying, you'll probably just walk through most of it. But I can honestly say it's a game that I routinely found myself struggling with, and if I didn't do this for a living and had the time to just sort of brute force my way through these things, I very likely would have given up on it. I'm glad I didn't though, because I think it was a pretty great experience. experience overall, so there's that at least. That does bring us to number 2, however, and this one is The Witcher 2. Probably the strangest of the 3 Witcher titles, I would say, but story-wise it's my favorite. It's got a huge branching narrative that has 16 endings, there's multiple ways through it, so there's a lot to like there story-wise. But specifically, what I found difficult with this game was an achievement that it took me technically years to get, but that's mostly because I wasn't actively trying the entire time. And in fact, it took me being able to do this for a living and turning this achievement into a form of work to get around to actually doing it. And that achievement was completing The Witcher 2 on Iron Man mode, which is called Insane Difficulty. And on its own, that probably wouldn't be that bad. But the problem with The Witcher 2 is that some of the combat is, I would say, borderline broken. Some of it just doesn't work. The hitboxes are crazy and can often be unpredictable, and that's to say nothing of QTE events that result in your instant death, a few conversation options that can lead to it too, and while you can turn the QTEs off and you can obviously learn which dialogue options not to pick, the one thing I really struggled with this game in particular was the fact that the combat was so incredibly inconsistent. So while you could argue, sure, that it's not terribly difficult per se, so much as the combat just doesn't always work the way you would expect it to, but at the same time, combat in The Witcher 2 often deals with numbers. That is to say, you can be swarmed by enemies, attacked from the back where you take double damage. So a lot of it is about positioning and isolating enemies and finding out the best way to do those things, which on its own is a decent challenge. But then you combine it with the fact that, again, occasionally the combat and the hitboxes are just not, I would say, working as intended. And you've got a game that I personally found very difficult. So much so that I tried multiple times over the years to get this achievement, failed several times. And in fact, if you look at my Steam profile, which is public, and check out this game in particular, you can see that I originally started it in like 2012, and I only very recently finished the 100% on this one back in April of this year, which I was only able to do because I was like, I'm going to review this game and make just doing this thing the whole purpose so I can finally get this off my chest. And while that was a very cathartic experience, which was admittedly a little easier than I thought it was going to be, mostly just down to the time that I have to commit to these things these days, it is still a game that I gave up on multiple times only to keep coming back to, so at the very least it's one of a few games that I certainly put the most effort into by far. But that brings us to number 3 on the list with another more recent title, and that is Aliens Dark Descent, a real-time with pause TRPG that released just earlier this year, back in June, and given the franchise it is set in, I think it definitely needed to be a difficult game, because if you were just kind of walking all over the aliens, narratively I think that would ruin it a little bit, and I think the challenge that they implemented here adds a lot of tension to the overall narrative. But in Aliens Dark Descent, you're effectively trying to save a planet from an infestation of the aliens, which you do by controlling a squad of Marines you have to take care of, who can get stressed out, traumatized, and over time slowly sort of degrade their own combat effectiveness as you try to make your way through missions. Now the good news is you can attempt a mission, so to speak, multiple times with your progress being saved, so a mission might take you 2 or 3 deployments to get down. The downside to this is that there is a doomsday clock ticking after a certain point in the game, just to add some more of that narrative tension, and those things combine to make a game where you never quite feel safe or like you're moving fast enough, especially because when it comes to the aliens themselves, there's no real end to them. They'll often attack you in waves at certain points. They can also unleash hunts on you where they come after you just time after time. You can rile up the hive the longer you're in a mission, which will lead to increasing responses from the aliens. And on higher difficulties, this is an especially tough system to get to grips with because, again, you're vastly outnumbered because the enemy just doesn't stop. And if I had jumped into this game directly into hard mode, I don't think I could have done it. Now these days, generally because I play games so often, and for reviews, if I know I'm going to be playing through something multiple times, I'll usually start my first playthrough on like whatever the normal difficulty is, as that is the closest to a normal experience that I could get, and for a review, you want that. And then on subsequent playthroughs is usually when I'll crank the difficulty up. And even on normal, I was having a bit of trouble at first until I got to grips with the system, and then when I kicked it up to hard, everything about that playthrough was challenging, and if I hadn't learned tricks of how the systems worked in normal, I don't think I would have gotten through it. It's an incredible game, one of my favorites from this year, but it is challenging and stressful. Or at least it certainly has the potential to be, which is why it definitely earned its spot on this list. Though that does bring us to number 4, with another release from this year. We have the Miasma Chronicles. From the people that brought you Mutant Year Zero, which is relevant because a lot of the gameplay mechanics work very similarly, we have another TRPG set in a post-apocalyptic world where civilization was once great and almost a utopia before abruptly crashing down around everyone, with a substance called the miasma blanketing the landscape as a result. We play a character named Elvis who slowly learns to control this miasma through a glove his mother left him, which is just one part of a really interesting story. However, what made this game difficult for me was the ambushes on the max difficulty called Alpha Editor. You see, Miasma Chronicles, much like Mutant Year Zero before it, is somewhat of what I would call puzzle tactics. Outside of combat, you have a sort of infiltration phase where you can use stealth weapons to take enemies down silently before entering combat, and then ideally, if you set it up properly, you'll take very little to no damage. And because of the way things like cooldowns work and only taking down in combat, there is sort of a right way to approach things. And on normal, that's fine, but the problem with that is that there are certain parts in the game where you don't get the opportunity to do that. You get ambushed and dropped directly into combat. And because there are parts of the game that are still RNG based, like the damage and things you would take, I found that I often had to replay those encounters multiple times, because if you got unlucky, you would have characters being taken out before you even got to start the fight. But even once you get past that part, now you've got a huge deficit between you and the enemy thanks to this ambush, and every time I got into one of those situations, those fights were incredibly difficult to overcome. But this game in particular required a lot of trial and error and figuring out the best way to approach things at that difficulty, and I'm not ashamed to say it definitely gave me a run for my money. An enjoyable game though, with a really interesting world, and while it's definitely a little janky, I definitely felt it was worth pushing through all that for. Though that does bring us to our final entry, and this is a game I haven't talked about in quite some time, as it is UnderRail, an isometric CRPG set, as you might imagine, in an abandoned railway system of sorts, with some really incredible world building. But as many people might already know, UnderRail is a bit notorious for being a difficult CRPG to play. And while I do think it's a little more forgiving than people give it credit for, it is definitely a challenging game. It's very easy to back yourself into a corner that necessitates a restart, usually with your playthrough if your build doesn't pan out, because UnderRail is not really a game that tries to hold your hand. And what I found in particular difficult about this game, because I would say the combat is manageable once you get a feel for it and the abilities available to you, but what I often found difficult about this game is that it's easy to sort of find yourself in an unwinnable situation where you then have to reload a significant amount of time back to sort of undo what got you into that situation, even if it wasn't run ending, so to speak. And what I mean by that is there are certain quests that will teleport you to a place you cannot leave until you finish something. The problem is there's not always a lot of warning or preamble to this, which means you can put yourself in a situation that your character is just incapable of dealing with because you didn't see this situation coming, and then you have to reload, avoid it, come back later, that kind of thing. But even outside of situations like that, in UnderRail you are mostly alone. There are situations where you'll have people helping you fight, but by and large it's a solo game. Your character is a lone wanderer of sorts, which means as your character progresses through the game, you have to learn to rely on your own skills and be cautious in your approach to combat and make sure you have a well thought out plan before you tackle larger problems or objectives, and even then you're likely to have to die and retry many times to accomplish the more difficult things in the game. And even once you're familiar with all those systems, you might still run into problems, such as I did with the final boss, as I've mentioned on the channel a few times. My first playthrough of this game, I was using a build that did really fantastic up to that point, and then running into the boss was like hitting hitting a brick wall that my build was just not prepared for, and it was obviously way too late to back out. Luckily, the game often will build in workarounds and things like that, as it is an RPG at its core, and in the case of the last boss, there's a puzzle that is very complicated that you can do to weaken it. Ultimately though, I would say UnderRail is a game that is not afraid to let you fail, and if you are unafraid of failing and you can get over that, there is a wonderful RPG to be had that will see you exploring all sorts of interesting locations, worldviews, side content, why the world managed to end up like this, and later on some truly even more bizarre things than you would probably anticipate from a title like this. For all of those reasons, as challenging as UnderRail is, I think it is an incredibly rewarding RPG at the same time. But it's a game that definitely earned its reputation of being a challenging game. That though is going to pretty much do it for this video. There has been 5 games that were incredibly difficult that I've managed to 100%. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, and by all means let me know down below any games you in particular happen to struggle with, or particular parts of otherwise innocuous games that just happen to be more challenging, or maybe even want to mix it up a little bit and tell me about games that were supposed to be challenging that you just destroyed, because sometimes that happens too. In any event though, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.